Night in the FrenchQuarter moved like molasses, thick, breathless, and waiting. Gaslight shimmered through wrought iron balconies, turning the cobblestones below into veins of amber. Inside a tall townhouse, the wedding celebration had quieted. The last laughter faded into the humid dark. By dawn, that same house would be the scene of a disappearance no one could explain. Behind a door locked from the inside, the young bride, Amelie, was gone. Her silk shoes stood neatly beside the bed, her jewelry, her gown untouched. The balcony rose 3 stories above a courtyard slick with rain, far too high for any descent. There was no note, no struggle, no sound in the night. Only one thing was wrong: her portrait, commissioned just weeks before the wedding. The painting hung opposite the bed, a grand image of devotion and status. But across the painted throat ran a single crimson line, sharp and deliberate. It hadn't been there the night before. It wasn't a red an artist's pigment. It gleamed wet, almost oily, as though some living impulse had marked in anger or urgency. Her husband swore he'd been steps away in the adjoining dressing room. Servants whispered about ghosts, about omens that follow unwanted vows. But when an aging Creole inspector arrived with a small oil lamp and quiet precision, he sensed something far stranger, a message written not in blood, but in defiance. The house smelled of lemon oil and old varnish, the same scent that lingered in rooms kept for show. Outside, the quarter's night noise softened to a low, distant clatter. Inside, every sound seemed amplified: a footfall, a hinge, the rustle of silk. The husband moved through the rooms like a man who had misplaced a map of his life. Precise orders once given without thought now lodged like a stone in his throat. He repeated the same line to anyone who would listen. He had been only steps away, in the dressing room, dressing himself for sleep while his bride prepared in the bedchamber. But the empty bed refused his explanation. Servants gathered in hushed knots in the back passage in the kitchen, exchanging glances that kept their reasons to themselves. In houses like this, staff were the silent arteries that carried the household's motion. They saw arrivals before the masters, knew which doors stuck and which bolts seized. Their testimony mattered not because they were important to law, but because they understood how a house moved. A woman could cross from nursery to gallery without her presence being noticed at the front door. A cloak could vanish in the dark. A servant corridor could carry a body or a woman who chose to leave. When the inspector arrived, he carried neither bluster nor theatrical tools. His lamp threw a narrow cone of light, and his voice asked precise, quiet questions. He moved with a habit born of looking at houses the way other men looked at faces. Attention to the fine lines, the seams that told where something might open. He inspected the bed for sleep impressions, the window for hair caught on a sill, the balcony for signs of makeshift rope. Each absence was as sharp as a mark. No drag on the floor, no scraped plaster, no disturbed mortar. The locked door had not been forced. Then he focused on the portrait. What at first looked like a single violent slash revealed itself, under inspection, as a story of materials. The marked surface resisted the dull sheen of artist's oil. It had a thicker, almost waxy gloss. When the inspector tilted his lamp, tiny wood splinters gleamed within the smear, slivers that had come from old, brittle frames, not from a fresh blade. He tested the frame's edge with a gloved finger and felt a hairline give. The panel was heavier than a simple canvas, the gilding concealing seams. In houses of an older order, paintings were sometimes mounted on boards. Craftsmen would reinforce them with backs that could, if altered, become doors. Lipstick, in the era's common formulas, was no mere colorant. Makers mixed carmine pigments with oils and waxes to produce a stick that would both stain and glide. It could smear thick, leave an oily residue, and cling to metal. The inspector, familiar with these textures from countless household inventories and theatrical shops near the river, noticed that the smear's composition matched. Whoever had made that mark had used something on hand, a hurried, intimate tool, and in doing so had left traces that only attention could read. Attention, in this case, pulled the threads of the room apart. The smear splinters suggested contact with an old bolt. The bolt suggested a mechanism. The mechanism suggested a concealed opening. The inspector placed his lamp closer, searched around the frame for irregularities, and found a faint, narrow seam where plaster met gilding. His gloved thumb pressed a place imperceptible to casual sight. The frame gave with a small, muffled click. When the portrait swung outward, darkness exhaled from a narrow throat of shadow, a corridor that smelled of dust, stale air, and the faint, iron tang of time. The husband's color drained away. The servants shifted their weight, as if the house itself had made a noise they could not name. The discovery reframed everything. The locked door remained locked. The balcony still rose 3 stories, but a hidden route existed that rendered the room's isolation an illusion. In that moment, the case moved from the realm of the impossible to the realm of choices. The mark on the canvas was no longer merely a stain. It suggested a decision, a tool repurposed for a single act. The hallway's darkness offered possibilities that did not fit neat headlines. The inspector's lamp caught a single drop slipper at the passage's threshold, a small, human object that anchored speculation in the reality of a body that had stepped through, not been taken. As the portrait closed again, soft as a curtain, the house seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the quarter continued its slow commerce. Inside, the question that would drive everyone forward was not whether a crime had been committed, but why a woman would choose that passage over marriage's public frame, and where that passage would lead. The inspector did not hurry. He threaded questions through quiet rooms like a seamstress testing a hem. Small, persistent, exact. Servants were gathered in the kitchen courtyard under the thin light of an oil lamp, their faces half hidden by caps and collars. They spoke in guarded phrases at first. What they had seen, what they had brought up the back stairs, what time the carriage left. Their answers were precise about hours and sounds, vague about feelings. In households where social order governed speech, people learned to keep their reasons private. Still, the inspector listened for the slips, a pause that suggested fear, a bright laugh that did not belong to mood, a hesitation where a hand reached for a word. The husband presented a different problem. His voice carried the authority of ledgers and invoices. Numbers and schedules had been his language for years. When pressed, the count of minutes did not match the count of appearances. He said he had been in the dressing room, but servants describe a man who shut himself away with papers more often than with his wife. Those who worked closest a married couple hinted at tensions in small acts. A curt word over an ill-tied ribbon, a door left open because orders were given without courtesy. Nothing amounted to a motive for violence. What it began to form was motive for leaving. Forensic traces, small, mundane things, shaped the inspector's theory. The smear across the portrait's throat had the gloss of an oil-based formula. Lipstick of that era often combined carmine dye with beeswax and lanolin. It could smear thick, cling to metal, and pick up splinters from old wood. The gloved finger that touched the smear came away with a faint red tack. Near the passage's mouth, dust bore the soft impression of a slipper print. A shallow depression rather than a scuffle. A servant's apron snagged on a nail outside the doorway. Thread pulled thin and left attached. A sign of hurried movement, not a struggle that would leave bruises or blood. The hidden corridor led to a service stair that wound down toward a narrow yard. There, the inspector found evidence that suggested someone had used the back exit. A crate that normally lay stacked against the wall had been shifted, leaving a darker imprint on the stone. A short length of rope, frayed at the end, lay coiled where hands might have dropped it. None of these were proof of escape to a distant shore. They were proof of planning and opportunity, the practical inventions people deploy when they intend to disappear. Social reality weighed on the case as heavily as these objects. In this part of the city, marriages among the well-to-do bound property and reputation. A shipping magnate's marriage was not merely private life. It was a public alliance with economic stakes. Women of Amelie station moved within rules written by inheritance and respectability. For some, those rules felt like shelter. For others, they tightened into a cage. The inspector, who had watched household rhythms for decades, understood how a person might choose absence over admission. Rumors moved quicker than proof. Upstairs, neighbors whispered that Amelie had once refused to attend a grand supper hosted by her husband's partners. Downstairs, a young maid said she had caught the bride practicing exits in the hush before dawn. None of these claims survived scrutiny, but they altered the tenor of the inquiry. The question shifted from whether she had been taken to why she might have left. The husband's grief, genuine, performative, or complicatedly both, became part of the fabric investigators had to read. He paced with the precise anxiety of a man whose business depended on predictability. He counted the hours aloud until his voice frayed. In private, he demanded the inspector press the staff for facts that would justify a police action. In public, he accepted condolences with the patient, a man who knows reputations can be repaired with the right narrative. The inspector's report would later describe details with the quiet restraint of someone who records what he sees rather than what he feels. He cataloged the smear, the splinters, the shoe impression, the crate's indentation. He noted the absence of forced entry, the lack of blood, the neatness of an unpacked bed. His testimony did not conclude with certainty but with probability, that a woman, using what she had opened a secret way out and walked through it. What the report could not convey was a human choice folded inside that act. Objects tell the how, not always the why. The lipstick smear became, in the inspector's mind, a small emblem of decision, a utilitarian motion transformed into a mark that read like a sentence. It suggested haste, yes, but not panic, a plan executed with the tools at hand. As the light from a lamp pooled over the threshold of the hidden corridor, the house felt both smaller and wider, small for the life it contained, wide for the possibilities it offered beyond the frame of the portrait. By the time word began to spread to the quarter, the story had already split into versions: a tragic vanishing, a staged disappearance, a clever escape. Each version told listeners more about their fears and about the woman whose life had redirected itself under the gilded surface of her own painting. The inspector kept to his facts, but the city was not patient for fact alone. It wanted a shape to the mystery, a conclusion to rest against. What would take to satisfy that hunger was more than evidence. It would require a trail, a real path that led toward a horizon or the absence of one. News spreads away smoke does in a city of narrow streets, a thin line that thickens as it catches on shutters and soapstone steps. By morning, neighbors had leaned from windows. By noon, the square outside the townhouse hummed with talk. The husband hired men to search the property from cellar to roof. Merchants at the port muttered about disrupted business. The inspector, who preferred slow work to loud displays, had to navigate a new reality. The case had become public theater, and the city's appetite for a tidy ending sharpened every hour. He began where the house's anatomy pointed, down the service stair, and out into alleys that smelled of salt and tobacco. The passage emptied into a narrow yard behind a row of warehouses. Crates and sacks made temporary walls. A shack where a cooper repaired barrels gave off the low music of tapping wood. Dock workers passed with broad shoulders and eyes conditioned to notice hands rather than faces. The inspector moved among them with the timbre of a man who belonged to the city by habit, not by birth. He asked simple questions, the kind that let strangers take small steps toward trust. Did anyone see a woman leave? Was anyone hired to move a crate last night? Did anyone carry a trunk? Answers were rarely clean. A bargeman remembered a woman's silhouette stepping along a shadowed alley at dawn, her skirts closed tight, a small bundle clutched under her arm. He could not swear it was Amelie. He offered only what his sight had given him: height, gait, a flash of a shoe. A washerwoman said she had seen a pale face at a doorway, peering out as though choosing a night to begin. Others swore they had seen no one. Some accounts contradicted others. The inspector recorded them all with the same steady hand. The trail, such as it was, lay in fragments. He turned to places where anonymity could be bought. Boarding houses for river hands, the theater near the river where traveling troops stayed, packet offices where tickets and passage changed hands. In an office lined with shipping schedules, a clerk remembered Amelie's husband checking steamer times 2 nights before the wedding. Perhaps business, perhaps habit. The clerk's ledger bore a notation that suggested someone had inquired about a specific cabin class on a steamer bound upriver at first light. The inspector filed the note but kept his voice low. Facts that suggested planning might also suggest consent. Rumor ran faster than receipts. Half the quarter whispered that the bride had taken passage on a riverboat to New Orleans, the suburbs. Others said she had taken a carriage south toward plantations where distant relatives could hide a woman without questions. The husband paid handsomely for notices and posters, her likeness printed and pinned to posts, a reward offer for information. Sometimes official pressure and private grief aligned. Sometimes they did not. The inspector watched how money reshaped attention. Men who had not noticed the house's comings and goings found reasons to speak when a reward appeared. He also listened to those who had no reason to lie. The maid who found the slipper at the passage's mouth provided a small, decisive detail. The slipper's stitching had been scarcely finished. Its leather soft in ways new leather is soft. The sort of shoe a bride will wear once or twice, not a servant's well-worn pair. That suggested haste, that mixed planning with improvisation. A neighbor who tended window boxes reported a carriage with an unusual coachman's not near the harness, a detail the inspector sketched into his mental ledger. Small facts, when stitched together, formed a map, yet the map refused a single line. Each lead opened several possibilities. If Amelie left of her own will, where did she aim? If she had helpers, who could move a woman through the city without drawing attention? If she left alone, how had she crossed thresholds that demanded names and payment? The inspector began to suspect that the truth might not be a single dramatic arc, but a braided set of choices. Tools and favors and the city's tolerance for those who slipped between its more visible networks. Outside the magistrate's office, crowds called for arrests and for comfort in equal measure. Inside, men in frock coats argued about whether private arrangements could excuse public disturbance. The inspector recorded depositions with the resolve of someone collecting weather data before a storm. He could describe the wind and the direction of the clouds, but he could not predict the thunder. By dusk, one more thread presented itself. A small traveling trunk found in a tavern storage room, its lock recently forced, and its interior smelling faintly of lavender and smoke. The trunk bore no name, but under the lining someone had tucked a scrap of paper, an address in a town upriver, written in a woman's slanted hand. The discovery did not solve the mystery. It widened it. It offered a destination, and the promise of a trail worth following. The inspector wrapped the scrap in folded paper and tested the next question on his tongue. Who among the household could read that handwriting and recognize the certainty of flight? As the sun slipped, the quarter's light thinned and the city's edges softened. The case, which had begun as a closed room and a painted throat, had opened into routes and rumors, alliances and silences. The portrait remained a closed mouth in the house's inner room. But outside, the city had become a network of possible exits. The inspector prepared to follow the trunk's clue upriver. He also kept one eye on the husband, whose power could reroute attention and resources with a banker's ledger. Between the trunk and the ledgers, the next day promised more questions, and a pressure that would test how much a city would bend to reclaim one of its own. The scrap of paper promised a line out of the quarter, an address upriver, written in a woman's hand. The inspector did not assume it would lead directly to Amelie. Papers are slippery things, but it offered a place to begin. He arranged passage on a morning packet. The city still clouded with rumor as the steam whistle roared, and the boat slithered away from the wharf. The river carried more than goods. It carried gossip and favors, men with purses and women with plans. Travel in those days was a public display as well as a practical matter. Names were recorded, cabins counted, and a stranger's presence noted by the clerk who kept the ledgers. The inspector watched faces and ledger entries in equal measure. The upriver town the scrap named was modest. Clapboard houses, a square with a single stone fountain, a wharf where a few packet lines tied up. It was a kind of place where newcomers did not go unnoticed for long. The inspector began at the address. A narrow house near the river, shutters closed as if to hold privacy inside. He knocked. A woman answered, cautious and polite. She recognized the name on the scrap and ushered him inside without fanfare. Inside, the inspector found simplicity, a small room smelling faintly of lavender and soap, a kettle on the stove, a child's small wooden toy on the floor. The woman who had taken in travelers and lodgers for coin confessed she had sheltered a young woman 2 nights earlier, a guest who paid in cash and asked only for a bed and a single tray of bread in the morning. She described a guest who kept her head down, who avoided questions. She spoke a neat bundle and a pair of shoes left at the bedside. When the inspector asked for the guest's name, the woman lowered her eyes. The guest had given a false name, she said, and had been gone by dawn. The pattern repeated in small ways across the town. A tobacconist recalled a woman buying a cheap shawl. The keeper of the river office remembered someone purchasing a ticket for a short passage upstream, then changing her mind and canceling. Nobody in the town saw violence. What they saw instead was a woman moving carefully, choosing times and places that minimize attention. These were not the traces of abduction. They were the fingerprints of someone who had mapped her movement and executed a plan. But the inspector wanted more than gestures. He turned to documents and to the particularities of business practice along the river. He found, in a clerk's subfolder, a notation in a messenger's hand, a folded note delivered to a local attorney a week before the wedding. The note's content was terse. Concerns about dowry arrangements, mention of a clause that would give the husband control of certain family lands. It named no scandal, but it suggested pressure on the bride's side to secure property through marriage. Legal papers, small and dry, often carried the force of lives. When he presented the facts to a woman who had once been a governess in wealthy houses, she offered a voice he did not find in the ledger. Young women sometimes trade one set of restraints for another, she said, and would rather risk disappearance than a life of prescribed obedience. Her words were not judgment. They were a map of possibility. The inspector folded her remark into his working theory. Here lay motive not hatred, but of refusal. Still, refusals need routes. The inspector followed the trail through commerce. A cooper who had shifted crates, a bargeman who had ferried a small trunk upriver at dawn, a coachman who had taken a coin to keep quiet about an odd passenger. Each person's testimony lacked the drama of confession, but together they suggested cooperation. Small favors exchanged for coin or for kindness. The inspector recorded names and gestures like stitches and seam, noting who had been paid and who had offered help for no recorded recompense. A turning moment arrived when a lodger at a tavern produced a scrap of writing tucked into a Bible, a hurried note that read, "If I cannot be given a husband, I can live another way. Forgive me." The handwriting matched the scrap found in the trunk. The paper's fibers were from the same mill. The note was not a proclamation, but a private vow, the kind found in kept pockets and folded into the hems of clothes. It suggested intention rather than coercion. Yet the river also offered the possibility of disappearance without return. Steamboats left and arrived with regularity, but so did informal traders who ran at odd hours and whose records were thin. The inspector kept watch at the wharves, questioning captains and calling the offices at sole passage. Men remembered women and their luggage. They remembered favors and fares. One captain, with ink permanently stained on his fingers, admitted to noticing a woman with a slim bundle who paid for a one-way cabin upriver, but then did not board when the boat pushed off at dawn. She had work to do that night, he said, or someone to meet. The statement carried no certainty, but offered frame, a rendezvous rather than a forced removal. By the time the inspector returned to the town square, the pieces felt less like a single narrative and more like choices braided by necessity and help. He had not found Amelie, but had found evidence of a plan, of people who made themselves useful in small ways. The scrap in the trunk was no one's entire truth, but it was proof that a woman had translated intent into movement. As the sun set over the upriver wharf and the inspector prepared to follow the next lead, he understood that this case would not resolve in a courtroom alone. It would require understanding the exchanges of favors and debts that bind cities, and the people who move through them. The trail was now not only legal, it was moral terrain, a set of decisions about what counts as consent as survival, and as the shape of a life refused. Back in the quarter, the case pressed on the inspector like a tide, small, persistent demands from a husband who wanted answers now, gossiping neighbors who wanted spectacles, magistrates who wanted reports that would not embarrass the city. Men with ledgers asked whether the missing bride might damage business. Women who repaired collars and hemmed gloves exchanged glances that held both sympathy and caution. The inspector found himself pulled between two kinds of obligation, the public duty to locate a missing person, and the private knowledge that some searches, once started, haul wide a life that others would prefer remain hidden. Money moved through this pressure like oil. The husband increased the reward and hired hands who spoke little and moved quickly. They searched riverbanks at dawn, turned over crates, and questioned captains with the blunt politeness of paid men. In the inspector's notes the names and rates were precise. Who had been paid, how much, which boats had been checked. Yet his work required more than hired muscle. It required people who understood the quiet trades of shelter and silence. Those people existed in corners of towns, often overlooked by men with ledgers. A midwife in a plantation town, upriver, had tended to more secrets than births. She knew which family would hide a daughter for a night, which boarding house took in strangers for coin, and which coachman could be trusted to hold his tongue. When the inspector described Amelie's broad-shouldered gait and the small, unfinished slipper found at the passage, the midwife's eyes sharpened. She spoke of a woman arriving at a farmhouse 3 nights earlier, her shawl pulled tight and her face pale but deliberate. The midwife had given shelter for a night, and then guided the woman toward a coachman who owed her a favor. Small currencies of obligation, a saved favor, a repaid kindness, threaded through the inquiry. A cooper had moved a crate not for coin, but because a woman had once lent him a needle. A washerwoman had kept quiet because, years ago, the husband's wife had given her work when she had none. The inspector began to understand the case as a lattice of favors. Not a single dramatic rescue, but many modest aids stitched together. These acts of help often carried no official record, only the memory of return. The husband's response hardened. He pushed the magistrate to issue orders to compel testimony. He sent letters to family members, invoking duty and reputation. In households where marriages sealed property, the idea of a bride walking away threatened more than private shame. It threatened legal arrangements that underwrote estates. Men who profited from stability had reasons to insist on recovery, yet the inspector noticed how often the push for legal action chilled witnesses. People who might have helped quietly refused to meet with men who arrived in black coats and stiff collars. At the same time, new small facts offered direction. A tavern keeper upriver remembered a woman paying cash for a coach seat heading toward the coast, a route that would offer anonymity among travelers and laborers. He described her wearing a brooch shaped like a small crescent, a trinket fashionable among women in certain families. The inspector compared that detail to a list of household silver and trinkets. A clerk confirmed a matching brooch listed among Amelie's effects. It was not proof of foot, but it narrowed the geography. The inspector also received an unexpected letter from a woman who had once been a governess in the magnate's household. She wrote with the economy of someone who feared being overheard. The marriage had been arranged with pressure, she said, and the bride had complained of feeling seen only as an addition to ledgers. Her words were not accusations, but context, an explanation that reframed the man's bewilderment as a narrative he had inherited. The inspector folded that sheet into his file. It carried less weight in court than it did in his conviction. Then a laundress at a coastal inn brought him a near-decisive piece. A package of linens wrapped in coarse paper, abandoned in a room where a woman had lodged for one night. Tucked into the linen was a scrap of fabric with a monogram that matched Amelie's. The inn's ledger showed a woman had taken a stagecoach south at dawn, paying a coachman who later admitted keeping his mouth shut for a coin and a promise. The promise, he said, was from a man who did not give his name, but wore no ring, a detail that suggested an arrangement rather than abduction. For the inspector, the evidence added up into a direction rather than a verdict. The trail pointed toward the coast, a place with ships and strangers and fewer questions asked. It suggested a departure that combined planning with urgent improvisation, a woman who had used favors, false names, and small payments to step beyond the frames that held her. As dusk gathered, the inspector prepared to follow the new lead. He knew the husband would press for speed. He also knew that every hasty action risked scattering witnesses and burning the quiet trails people use to help others leave. The next steps required a balance between force and discretion, the kind of policing that listened for favors as closely as it listened for facts. The house in the quarter still kept its portrait closed and its bolts smeared. Outside, a woman moved through a network of small mercies toward an uncertain horizon. The inspector would chase that horizon, but first he had to decide how loudly he would call for its map. The coast had a smell that was all open sky, salt, tar, wet rope. It felt like a place that could dissolve identities. The inspector walked the wharf with the deliberate pace of someone who has watched too many departures. His lamp was useless here beneath noon sky, but his habit of looking closely did him good. Dock workers shaded their eyes and pointed toward coaches that came and went, toward weathered captains who measured time by tides and temperament. The trail had narrowed, but it did not yield easily. At a coaching inn facing the main road, the inspector found records and witnesses that fit the pattern. A woman who paid cash for a single night room, a shawl left behind, a hairpin tucked into the wash basin. The innkeeper recalled a woman who dined quietly and rose before dawn, who asked for the earliest coach south. He also remembered a coachman who took extra coin and a quiet look when a man arrived late asking about departures to a nearby harbor. The coachman's recollection was spare. He had taken a fare at dawn, a woman with a small bundle whose face he could not clearly place beneath her veil. The inspector next visited the harbor masters and the packet offices. Paperwork was a poor shield against attentive questioning. Names could be falsified, but physical descriptions, ticket stubs, and the memory of clerks often held. He inspected passenger lists, cross-referenced cabin assignments, and examined the ledgers where stevedores logged cargo by hand. One clerk remembered a young woman purchasing a one-way berth on a small coastal schooner bound for an island south of the port. The schooner was known for swift runs and for captains who preferred discretion. The clerk produced a stub with a smudged ink mark and a note in the margin. Paid in coin, no baggage recorded. Coin had bought more than passage in that time. It purchased silence and small favors. The inspector visited the schooner's owner, a wiry man with hands like old rope. The owner admitted a woman had boarded at dawn, wrapped in a shawl, carrying nothing but a satchel. He described her as polite but reserved, someone who had paid in advance and asked to be left alone. The description fit the mosaic of details gathered upriver and in town. The owner also offered a final, reluctant note. The woman had asked the captain if she could be set ashore at the next stop, away from regular shipping lanes. The captain obliged, trading immediate coin for the quiet passage of a passenger who wanted to disappear. The inspector, who had expected to find a crime scene, instead found choices crowding one another. The evidence pointed to a deliberate removal from the city's everyday networks, not by force but by arrangement. The coastal jig gave the bride the advantage of anonymity. Islands and inlet towns took strangers without question, and the sailor economy tended to barter privacy for pay. If she had wished to vanish, the coast offered routes that mainland towns could not easily trace. Still, some facts resisted easy interpretation. A sailor who unloaded cargo at the island recalled a woman who had disembarked alone and walked toward a stand of low houses near the salt marsh, her satchel small and her head bent. He had meant to note her face, but when he returned she had disappeared into a narrow lane between two dwellings. Another witness, a woman who ran a small bakery, remembered leaving a tray on a doorstep for a lodger who paid in coin and handed a folded note that asked the baker to keep a candle lit until the lodger left at dawn. The baker, who kept little gossip, had folded the note into a drawer. When the inspector asked for it, she produced a flimsy scrap with a single line, "I go to be someone else. Tell no one I came here." The handwriting matched the note from the trunk. The husband's presence on the coast changed the tenor of local memory. Him arriving, speaking in the clipped tones of businessmen, caused some to harden. Men who might privately have shown a passenger favor were reluctant when a magnate's ledger was in view. He organized searches, hired local guides, and posted notices, but his money could only push so far into places that protected anonymity by habit. The inspector watched the man press for leads, saw how his insistence tightened the network of help rather than widen it. People who might have sheltered a stranger grew cautious when a prominent name hovered. Yet one small lead offered a fragile hope. In a low tavern near the inlet, a sailor claimed to have seen a woman speaking quietly with a woman known in the region for arranging passage for women who wished to leave difficult households. The arranger, a slender woman with a ledger of favors and debts, ran a small business, helping people move on for reasons both public and private. She confirmed receiving a coin in a sack, and she admitted to offering a route by which a woman could find work in a distant town under a new name. The arranger described the guest with a tenderness that suggested empathy rather than profit. The woman was deliberate, composed, and unwilling to explain. That account located agency where rumor had earlier placed only victimhood. It suggested that the bride had mobilized a network of allies, people who knew how to move without being recorded. The inspector noted the arrangers and the coachman in his book. He understood that proving a plan in court required more than testimony from those who earned a living in shadows. As the sun sank and harbor lights began to prick the evening, the inspector stood at the water's edge and watched the schooner that had carried the woman vanish into a low horizon. He held fragments, a scrap of paper, a ticket stub, a burned-out slipper, and with him a portrait of an act that mixed intent and escape. The next step would require following a human trail that refused to show up cleanly in ledgers, the kind of pursuit that asked for patience, discretion, and the willingness to believe that not every disappearance deserved a lock and a verdict. The city kept talking long after the inspector folded his last note. The husband returned to his ledgers and to a household rearranged by absence. The inspector returned to records and patients who needed his calm. The portraits in the townhouse remained hung, but one now carried an odd history that visitors asked about in low tones. The painted throat's crimson line faded unevenly with time. Some called it a stain, others a mark of courage, and the frame seam was patched with small, discreet repair. The household learned to live with an image that refused easy interpretation. For the inspector, the case never ended as neatly as a signed report. He closed the formal file with a notation of probable flight and a recommendation that the husband pursue civil remedies if he wished to recover property or reputation. In his private journal, he wrote something less official. The evidence suggested a woman had chosen a course that mixed planning and improvisation, and the city had offered routes, small favors, and people willing to risk a polite lie for another person's freedom. He recorded names of those who had helped and kept their notes separate, as if some stories ought to remain out of court. The husband's life continued under a film of unease. He paid for searches and notices for months, and his social circle watched closely for how grief would translate into action. Some merchants shrugged and returned to business. Others lingered, waiting for scandal to settle into gossip that could be managed. He married again years later, a union that smoothed some legal knots, but left an ache that money could not wholly cover. Whether his marriage ended in private compromise or quiet understanding remained known only to his household. Amelie's fate never appeared neatly in official records. Some years later, a woman matching her description is listed in a register of apprentices at a small mill in a coastal village. Her name altered slightly and her origins vague. A midwife's note marks a woman of similar age marrying a modest tradesman and living a life far from ledgers and steam whistles. None of these documents carries a certainty that any single entry is the same person. They are, however, the kinds of small traces that suggest movement from one world into another. The portrait's red line became a story with many versions. To some it was a confession, to others an act of rebellion, to others still a clumsy accident of oil and haste. Over time the story was told at kitchen tables and in taverns as a parable, a warning to families who arranged unions without listening, a quiet celebration for those who valued self-determination. In the quarter, the image acquired a life outside its frame. People treated it as evidence that lives are made of choices both public and private. What this case left behind mattered beyond one household's drama. It illuminated how cities contain routes that do not belong to official maps, routes made of favors, debts, and discretion. It showed how material things, lipstick, a loosened bolt, a discarded slipper, carry meaning that careful attention can read. It revealed that systems that protect property and reputation can, by design, limit human freedom, and that escape often requires community in small and unexpected forms. For storytellers, the case offers a lesson about evidence and empathy. Objects can point toward choices, but they rarely tell the whole interior life that preceded them. A smear across a canvas can be read as violence or as irreverence. The difference depends on context, on who tells the story, and on what questions are asked. The inspector chose to record what he saw and to leave judgment lighter in his notes than in his talk. That restraint preserved lives and allowed others to keep their secrets. Years later, when tourists pass the townhouse and ask behind a low gate whether the portrait is real, local guides answer with variations. Some insist it is a stage drama. Others treat it as a small, human defiance caught between frames. The truth resists tidy confirmation. In its resistance lies the story's lasting thrust. Human choices are seldom pure. They are braided with help, luck, fear, and hope. The painted face in the house kept its eyes steady. The crimson line, once raw and accusing, mellowed into a reminder that a life has more than one surface. For anyone who reads the case across seasons and decades, the lesson is plain. History asks us to look closely at the small things. In those slivers of evidence we encounter not only events but the texture of decisions. The bride who stepped through a hidden door left behind a framed question. When does a life demand leaving? And who will help you go?